Ventilation-perfusion coupling. Now I've mentioned this in the previous video, but I want to go into a little bit more about what it actually is. Now ventilation itself. Ventilation is dealing with the amount of gas reaching the alveoli. So the air you breathe in, what is getting down to the actual alveoli? Well, perfusion, that's the blood flow that's going around the alveoli. Why is it important to make sure they need to be coupled together? Well, they have to be matched pretty close to, if not exactly, to optimize gas exchange. Because that gas that goes into the alveoli, ventilation, that oxygen is being dropped off and you need to pick up carbon dioxide. Well, the blood flow coming in is what picks up the oxygen and then drops the carbon dioxide. If the amount of blood and the amount of gases coming in are not matched, then you end up with too much oxygen inside the alveoli, or you end up with not enough to actually make sure the blood's oxygen rich. So you try to make sure this ventilation perfusion is matched perfectly to make sure you're utilizing the oxygen coming in and you're maximizing the flow of blood going through the system. So if we start looking at this, so if the alveolar O2 partial pressure is high, then the arterioles dilate. Let's think, does that make sense? So the alveoli has a high amount of oxygen compared to normal. The arterioles, the blood flow, dilate. Sure, makes sense. Because you have more oxygen here than you can get into the blood. Which means by dilating the arteriole, you bring more blood in to match the amount of oxygen that's present. So each breath, you now have more blood flow to that area to pair off with a higher oxygen concentration. But if the alveolar O2 is low, so that partial pressure is low, whether you're at a high altitude or there's some obstruction or blockage or whatever, then the arteriole is going to constrict because you don't have enough oxygen coming in to maximize and fill out those red blood cells. So send less blood to the area, so therefore you are matching the lower blood flow, lower oxygen, everything matches up the way it should. So if you want to look at it this way, we're having up here, we're having the adequate blood flow, but now ventilation is lower. You don't have enough oxygen getting to that alveoli. So it ends up saying, you know what? Let's constrict. Because with lower oxygen amounts, the lower partial pressure of oxygen, we can't get enough into the blood to make sure the blood is fully oxygenated before it leaves. Less blood flow pairs up with the lower oxygen. But on the flip side, if the ventilation is greater than the perfusion, that means you have more O2 present. So you have a higher partial pressure of O2 compared to the blood flow. You dilate, so therefore now you've increased blood flow around that alveoli, and therefore the higher oxygen get picked up to the higher blood flow. So pretty much ventilation perfusion is looking at oxygen concentration and blood flow. If oxygen concentration goes up in the alveoli, blood flow better go up around it. If oxygen concentration goes down, blood flow better go down. They're meant to be matched and equaling off. Now, if you want to, you can look at the carbon dioxide levels as well, but that's then the opposite. So a lot of times, if you're saying that you end up with too much carbon dioxide in an area, you don't want to dump more off in there, there's already too much. You're losing your gradient. So you cause a constriction. But a lot of times think of oxygen, because oxygen goes up, the actual blood flow goes up. So ventilation up, perfusion up. So let's look into that transport of carbon dioxide though. Because obviously we mentioned that carbon dioxide is coming in the venous blood to the lungs and getting dropped off. But it's not just simply staying as carbon dioxide the whole time. Carbon dioxide will combine with water. So CO2 plus H2O ends up creating H2CO3. That's carbonic acid. But now that carbonic acid won't really stick around very long, because pretty quickly the carbonic acid is going to dissociate into a hydrogen ion and HCO3 minus. So that was basically H2CO3, just you lost a hydrogen, and now you have HCO3 minus. That's hydrogen and bicarbonate. Bicarbonate, hopefully that rings a bell. We've talked about that before as a buffering agent. So we're looking at, again, a way to buffer the bloodstream and transport carbon dioxide at the same time. Now, most of this kind of formula back and forth from CO2 plus H2O to H2CO3 to H plus and then HCO3 minus happens inside the red blood cell. It's facilitated by an enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. Now that carbonic anhydrase helps facilitate this reaction at a much faster rate inside the red blood cell compared to outside the red blood cell without the enzyme. It still occurs, but occurs more slowly. So for our external respiration, now think external respiration is alveoli to capillaries, so we're breathing around the lungs here. In the pulmonary capillaries, so that's what we're talking about, just around those alveoli, you're going to have HCO3 minus moving into the red blood cells and binding with hydrogen. That creates H2CO3. Because you can't simply exhale HCO3 minus. It doesn't work that way. You can exhale carbon dioxide, CO2, but you've got to get back to that form. So then once you've combined the HCO3 minus and the hydrogen ion, making the carbonic acid H2CO3, then carbonic anhydrase steps in, you split it, carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide is what diffuses into the alveoli, and you exhale that. So here's a visual way to look at that. What's happening here now is the blue is going to be carbon dioxide, the red is oxygen. Now sure, I show oxygen coming from the alveoli into the red blood cell already, but we want to focus on the carbon dioxide. So what's going to happen here, I'm blowing this up full screen so you can see now what just happened. We have two different things. You'll notice that this arrow is not as thick as the arrow right above it. The thicker the arrow, the higher amount of carbon dioxide moving. So we have right here, you'll notice here's the combination, HCO3 minus plus hydrogen that is occurring inside the red blood cell. It's going to H2CO3, and then via carbonic anhydrase, CO2 and H2O. That CO2 is what's going to leave. But at the same time, and that's the majority of it, you still have a decent amount that simply is being brought in via hemoglobin, carbaminohemoglobin. Now in this case, that's then simply coming off and you go through the carbon dioxide again. But also, external to the red blood cell, you'll see the same exact reaction here is occurring, but it's occurring slower. It's slower because you do not have the carbonic anhydrase. And you even have some basic old carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma going across. So pretty much what that means is there's multiple ways your body is transporting carbon dioxide and then getting it into the alveoli so you can exhale it as waste. All right, now internal respiration. That was external. Internal respiration, remember, is going to be between the blood and your tissues, so are not in the lungs. In this case, the partial pressure and diffusion gradients are in reverse. So we have the gradient being higher in the blood, lower in the alveoli for carbon dioxide. Here, it's the opposite. Because you want to get things, carbon dioxide, into the blood. Or in the case of oxygen, you want the oxygen to go into the tissues. So gradients can be different in reverse. So for example, partial pressure of O2 is always higher in the blood, lower in the tissues. That way the oxygen is going from the blood into the tissue to provide oxygen to all your body tissues. Now in the systemic capillaries, you're going to look at HCO3 minus is quickly diffusing out of the red blood cells. It's heading out in the plasma. Now this is occurring. We have this chloride shift occurring at the same point. So the HCO3 minus, the bicarbonate, from the red blood cells is balanced by the movement of chloride ions. Because you can't have this negative ion leaving without replacing it. So you have this shift occurring. One goes in, one goes out. We equal everything off. You maintain a balance of the electricity, basically. You're balancing off the two negative charges. So look at the same thing here. We're going to blow this up full screen. We're looking again at the carbon dioxide. Now, first off, carbon dioxide can come from the cell tissues right into the plasma of the blood. Just a direct dissolve. Then we have that same formula we talked about before. We have our CO2 plus H2O, then forms into H2CO3, carbonic acid, and then it forms into HCO3 minus, and then the hydrogen ion plus. But since this is outside in the plasma, this is slower. In the red blood cell, you'll notice that now this is occurring much faster because of the carbonic anhydrase. So the same formula just occurs faster. Then what you do is you're taking that HCO3 minus, getting it outside the cell. You're pulling chloride in. That's the chloride shift. So that allows the equilibration to happen, keep the charges the same. Or again, you have carbon dioxide with hemoglobin, carbaminohemoglobin. So again, looking at how things are moving here, multiple ways for them to move, but making sure that you're still getting carbon dioxide out of your tissues, into the blood, so it can be transported up to the lungs. Now, the way this is transported, I have some percentages here, but please don't memorize the exact. Just know that the majority is transported via bicarbonate, HCO3 minus. Now that says about 70%, 20% here is the carbaminohemoglobin, and then it leaves about your 7 to 10% simply dissolved. Now if you're doing the math and saying 70 plus 20 plus 7 doesn't really match, no, obviously there's ranges. So that's why don't memorize exact, know which is the most common, HCO3 minus, which one's the least common, that's a direct dissolve in the plasma. But there are multiple ways to get carbon dioxide from your tissues up to the lungs. So a little about carbon dioxide transport, seeing how it's moving throughout the body, and keep in mind ventilation-perfusion coupling. Make sure that the blood and the gases coming in are coupled properly.